the people who you bring on the channel, just such a wide array of stories and experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I think Sophia is the one I watched, or Sophie. I believe they're transgender, homeless, sort of.
Yeah, sounds familiar. I've done so many.
Yeah, it's addiction issues down on Skid Row, but just had, obviously, seen a lot. And one of those stories was just like, this is stuff that people who are just even struggling with that type of situation can see.
I see the people that email me about just thanking me for doing what I do. I see how it helps people that are in recovery. I see how it helps like people who are considering getting into some of these crazy substances. I also see how it helps parents be better parents, or people who are just thinking of bailing and just like, I'd rather do this. But then you see what the aftermath is of that, which is almost all these stories. Bad parenting plays a role. I think it's just really good to keep posting this kind of information to help people navigate life.
Yeah. And Sonny and Zet, it's all walks, man, right? It's all walks.
Mm-hmm. So tell me your story. You grew up where?
So I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Bryn Mawr Hospital. And I grew up the first 5 years of my life in Virginia, in a small town called Dahlgren on a naval base. My father was in the Navy. He was a doctor. My mother was, a dental hygienist, and then like a stay-at-home mom, right? And I grew up, I think I grew up with what every child believes, which is my life is normal. I have a normal childhood, right? And I had a mother, I had a father, we had a house, I went to school, I had friends, and there were a lot of, that was just my reality. I remember as a kid, I used to watch airplanes land in our backyard, and that was cool to me, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot, I wanted to be an astronaut, I wanted to, have this exciting life. I think that my father had always, who had said, I'm in the Navy and he flies airplanes and he's a fighter pilot. And I would later, kind of unravel all of this. But I looked up to my parents. I looked up to my father in a lot of ways when I was very young. And I had a happy childhood. And I can remember one story. I remember I was maybe like 3 or 4. I was watching a cartoon and there was a bullfighter and they were, holding the red flag, Toro, Toro. And I remember I closed my eyes, I turned around and I ran full steam towards my parents. And I hit my head on this very heavy, like Land's End table, kitchen table. And I split my head open. And I can remember crying, and obviously, and we're in my kitchen, and then my parents take me to the hospital because the naval hospital was on the naval base, and my dad's stitching me up, and I'm crying, and I'm eating like provolone cheese and salami, and I'm like trying to have my dinner, and I'm just like crying. My mom's like, it's okay, it's okay. But I remember like in that moment that my father, like being like the hero, right, and saving me. I have this blood, I have this injury, and being there for me, and then my mother being very close to me and seeing the look on her face of, like that I was her son, that she loved me so much, right? That I was like her world, and to see me in pain really affected her. And that obviously sticks with me. I don't even know what brought this up because I've never talked about this before. I never even thought of this until we were sitting here. But I think that was my first memory of an experience of pain and an experience of relief and release that my father gave me, and that my mother was just there for me, right? So a couple of years later, I was about 5 years old, and I remember this guy came down from a small town called Mansfield, Ohio, and he was a doctor as well. He came down to visit us to talk to us about moving to this place called Mansfield, Ohio. And my father got offered a job, and I was so young I didn't know what they were talking about, but he was going to run a hospital called People's Hospital. And I remember at that moment, okay, we're going to leave Virginia. We're going to leave. There's a lot of East Coast connection. Both my parents were from suburban Philadelphia. They were Ivy League educated at Penn, but they came from poor families. And that connection to go to a rural place in the middle of nowhere at that time, no disrespect to it, but that was a big jump. So this guy's name was Mr. Damoff, and he'd come down, and we were going to go to this mysterious place in Ohio. And I remember arriving in this small town, and here's me. As a kid, I had long hair, but I was very preppy. I wore penny loafers, and I was thrown into this, school and meeting these kids. And on the first week that we're there, I'm walking, and we're doing a nature hike, and I'm walking in penny loafers, and I step in a bee's nest. A hole, yellow jackets, the entire school. This is the first week I'm there, and it's right before we get out for summer break, the last day of school. The entire school gets stung by these yellow jackets. That was my introduction into this new town that we were living in. And but I quickly made friends, and it was cool, and I adjusted. Kids are good when they adjust, when they're, you can adjust well when you're a kid, but something sort of changed when we moved to Mansfield. And it could have been just because I was getting older. I was 5, 6 at the time. But it was the first time in my life that I had made friends with kids whose parents were divorced. I didn't even know what that was. And heard stories of, domestic violence. A lot of them were doctors, lawyers, kids, and, they would be with their mom during the week, and then they go to the dad's, every other weekend or whatever, shared custody. I remember thinking, I'm really grateful that I have a mommy and daddy that love me, right? And I still believe that. But I could see some cracks in the facade as I started getting older. My father wasn't around a lot. And as I'm getting older, 6, 7, 8 years old, the stories go, well, daddy's at work, or daddy's on call because he's doing private practice. He was working at this hospital, then he wasn't, then he had his private practice. And I would have these really wonderful memories of going around with my father and doing his rounds and singing and dancing to his patients and things like that. But that was some of the only times that I spent with him. So as a family unit, I started to spend most of my time with my mother and very little time with my father. And I couldn't quite put my finger on why that was, but I knew something was off. And one of the only things that my father and I did together was we would go on these ski trips during the winter. And my mom would come with us sometimes, but sometimes we would go by ourselves. And I remember one instance waking up alone in a hotel room and being like, where's my dad? And going down, exploring as a kid and going down to a bar and seeing my father talking to some woman in the bar. I think to myself, this is weird. And then thinking back to these stories that I hear from my classmates, that maybe something's a little odd. But my mother, did a lot to protect me. But I could tell that there was something going on. And that is when violence entered the home. My father, there were more and more arguments. My father was very temperamental. He was a rageaholic. And the littlest things would set him off. And I can remember one morning, it was like a Saturday morning, and I was making breakfast in the kitchen with my mother. I dropped an egg on the floor. And I dropped an egg. And my father got so enraged because I dropped this egg, he threatened to kill me. Got into a confrontation with my mother, screaming at her, screaming at me at the top of his lungs. My father was very tall, 6'3", 220, 30 pounds, a big guy. And he would scream at the top of his lungs, beg for your son's life. He slams the door and knocks all the window panes out of it. The glass shatters everywhere. My mother's sobbing. And I just thought, yeah, something's not good here. And I started, along with my mother, living in this life of don't set your father off. Don't make daddy angry. The sort of, they talk about, fight, flight, fawn, appease. walking on eggshells a lot when my father was around. But his being around was spurts during the day, and then most of the time he'd be sleeping on the couch at night, watching CNN, etc. But I was always very cautious around him. About mid 1988 was a big year because my grandmother, my mother's mother, had passed away at the end of 1987. And then my mother's father, who I was really close to, passed away. He had come to live with us in January of 1988. And later on that summer, my father's father passed away. And my grandfather was a big, Irish guy. I didn't know he was an alcoholic, but he was an alcoholic. And it seemed like once he passed away, that my family was really sort of fractured. And I never had a terribly close relationship with my cousins or, my aunts and uncles, except for my father's brother, who was like my mother's best friend. And we would go and see my Uncle Charles when I was a kid, and my mother would talk to him on the phone all the time, and I would talk to him on the phone all the time. So that was a great relationship. My mother had a relationship with her sister, but after the passing of both my grandparents, that relationship seemed to be kind of fractured. And but 1988 was a year where I started to see my own family unit sort of bifurcate. Dad wasn't around a lot. I was spending all my time with my mother. My mother was starting to talk about she wanted another child, but she wanted to adopt a little girl from Taiwan. And I was supposed to go with her in February of 1989. And again, there are a lot of fits of rage, tempers in the household, a lot of abuse by my father, a lot of emotional, verbal abuse towards my mother and I. But we always had each other. Like I always had my mom, And when we were supposed to go to Taiwan to meet this little girl's family, and I got really sick with asthma. I had asthma as a kid, started about when I was about 10 years old. And my father wouldn't let me go on the airplane because I had such a bad asthma attack. So I had to stay home with my father for 2 weeks while my mother was in Taiwan. And that was probably the worst time of my life because I was away from my protector, and my father's rampant anger and abuse was on full display. And during that whole time that my mother was gone, my father essentially tortured me in a lot of ways. Every moment he would ask me, what are you? And I'd have to answer, a stupid little fat boy. My father used to play catch with me in the yard, but he would try to throw a baseball at my nuts, my groin, try to injure me, try to throw it at my head and tell me that my mother was making me into a little, or I'm a little, and I'm not growing up like a man. And, he was very, Italian machismo kind of thing, whatever that is. And I never wanted to be him at that point. I talked about like my father was my hero as young, saving me in those moments when my head is bleeding and stitching me back up, or being there when I had asthma attacks to give me medicine to make me feel better. But I grew to really dislike my father. And especially in that time period of just really horrific things you say to a child. So my mother came back, and I never told her about it because he threatened to kill me if I had told her about that, and he would harm my mother. So I never did. And my mother ended up adopting this little girl from Taiwan who came into our lives. But before that, my father took me to a Memorial Day party. And this Memorial Day party was at a place that was, I don't want to say, it was country folk. It was simple folk. It was people that I was not raised around. They were barbecuing a hog. They were racing quads. They were walking around with their shirts off, drinking beer. I had never seen anything like this. But I remember he introduced me to a woman, and her name was Sherry. And Sherry had 2 kids, and I was there, and I had fun. I even got on the quad and was racing around the quad with Sherry on the back. And I remember I'd never ridden one before, and I went to swerve, and she almost flew off the back. And if that had happened, I probably wouldn't be telling this story here today. But she did not. And later on that evening at this party, I'm walking around a lake with these 2 little kids, and we're talking. And I look back, and my father has his arm around this woman. I'm like, okay. And we get in my father's truck later that night. And I said, so Daddy, who is that woman, Sherry? And he goes, oh, that's one of Daddy's patients. And she's terminally ill. And so Daddy was comforting her. And I was like, oh, that's, horrible. So, I never really thought anything of it. I thought it was odd. He had kissed her on the cheek before he left, but my parents kind of did that kiss thing with their friends, doctors' wives, that type of thing, because those were the majority of the people that we socialized with, doctors, lawyers, those families, going out to dinner, events type of things. But I would see Sherry again, and it was Father's Day that year. And my father said, hey, would you come with me to my office? I'm going to go grab some paperwork and we'll do whatever. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. And on the way back, and this is the late 80s, so this is everybody's sun tanning, so he wants to stop at the tanning salon. And out walks Sherry. And he goes, oh, well, look who's here. It's Sherry. And I'm like, okay. And she has 2 remote control cars. And she gives them to us like Happy Father's Day. And as she's handing those to me, I look at her hand, and she has a ring on. And this was a very special ring because this was a diamond slide ring that my mother had, a very similar, if not identical ring. And I said to her, I said, that's a really nice ring. My mother has one of those. And she just kind of giggled and looked at my father. I didn't think too much of it, and I'm playing with the radio control cars, and I look back and I see my father making out with this woman, and I had never seen that before other than movies. And I even remember when I was a kid, I would watch these rated R movies, and I'd have to cover my mom would tell me to cover my eyes, and when I was with my father, when my mother wasn't around, he would berate me and call me a little bitch and everything for covering my eyes when there's violence or sex scenes, because I was just, that's what I thought you were supposed to do as a kid. But I saw this play out in real life, and I thought, okay, this is like something's up here. And my father gets in the car, and I said, before I could actually even say anything, he says, look, Bumper was my nickname. I got that nickname as a kid because when I grew up on the naval base, I used to see the nose cones of the airplanes. I used to call them bumpers. So Bumper, because I used to think it was like a bumper on a car. And my father says, I don't want you to tell Mommy about what happened. I want you to tell her that I took you to the office and I gave you the radio control cars because you got good grades this year. And of course, being very afraid of my father, I thought, okay, sure, I'll say that. And that night, that day we went home, I told my mother the lie, and we went out and we had Father's Day dinner, and I acted like nothing was wrong. I had never lied to my mother before. And I felt horrible about it. I got so sick that night. And the next day I was playing with the radio control car in the driveway, and I was overwhelmed with guilt. And I came in and I said to my mother, I said, Mommy, I need you to sit down. She was on the back porch. And I said, I have something to tell you. I think Daddy's having an affair with this woman. Her name is Sherry. I saw her. She had the ring. I told her the whole story. And she thanked me for being honest with her, but she was upset because I lied to her, and she wasn't happy about that. But she understood that my father, I was afraid of my father, and my father asked me to do it. And I remember she went in and she made a phone call, and she was very angry. And that was probably one of the moments I was like, okay, now I'm like the other kids. Now I'm going to be, because even though I knew something was wrong in my household, even though I knew that whatever was going on wasn't normal, I had the family, like we were intact, right? So I had that to hold on to. I knew at that point she's going to divorce him because I'd seen this play out with other kids. And I remember we went out with my mother's best friend that day to sort of talk through a plan. And she was, unbeknownst to me, of course, my mother knew about the girlfriend. My mother knew that the girlfriend was pregnant. My mother knew about all my father's girlfriends. My father was a chronic womanizer for decades. But of course, I never knew this. I was protected by my mother. So all of this started to kind of unravel and slowly would unravel throughout the rest of my life in so many ways. And I remember I came home that night and my father had written and drawn this little note and said, "I love you." And he drew a little stethoscope, a little smiley face, like for the doctor. And "I still love you no matter what happens." And I thought, man, you're just like not a good guy. Like I already kind of knew that. I didn't like my father because of how he was treating us. But now it's like you're cheating on my mother. And the next 6 months were real hell because they were getting a divorce or at least a separation. My father wasn't living in the home. And he wasn't, to be honest, he wasn't there because he was always on his medical rounds and doing things. Unbeknownst to my father, he had another apartment with another woman and all this other stuff. But I had this, the experience was just, and my mother had this, I had this little sister that I knew that was in our lives. And my father started doing things like even just threatening to send her back to China. My father, started getting angrier and angrier with my mother and would tell me things like he's going to make sure that we don't have food. I'm not going to go to college. We're going to be out on the street by the time his lawyers are done with her. She's going to be working at McDonald's and I'm going to have to go to public school like all the other poor kids. All of this was a lot to pile on a kid, but I could see that he really is an asshole. He's a bad guy. And I, of course, thought that things would settle down. My father would move away. I would go to these like split weekend sort of situations, but it just kept escalating. And my father kept introducing me to his girlfriend, or we'd see them out and he'd be like, "Oh, I just bought them all new." Like he would buy them all new toys, or, "Oh, we're going to go do this. And I've got this new house and they're going to go live there and you'll never get to see it because you don't get to have that life." And I was his son, and he was starting a new life and he was very emphatic on letting me know that he's going to have a better life and give a better life to these children than I would ever have. And I can remember my mother saying to me one time, she picked me up from school and she didn't feel like cooking. We used to go to this place called Bob Evans, which is if you're from the heartland, you know what Bob Evans is. And we're driving down this place called Hanley Road, and my mother says to me, she goes, "Collier, I want you to know that if anything ever happens to me, I would never leave you. But if anything ever happens to me, your father had me killed." I thought, like that, like, hold on. Like, he's an asshole, but he's not a murderer. And I asked my mother, I said, "Mommy, that wouldn't happen, and I'll protect you, and that's not going to happen." And she goes, "No, your father has mafia connections, your father is this." And I did my best to sort of ease my mother's fears of like, that's just not going to happen, right? And, but it would stick with me. So the holidays come, this was right before Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving comes and goes. My father's not around. He's with his new family. And Christmas comes and goes, and it's New Year's. And my mother was very close to my father's mother, who lived in Ohio now after my grandfather had passed away. She moved over there. And she had come down, and she was supposed to come down for Christmas, but she couldn't. So she came down for New Year's. And it was very strange. And I remember this was December December 30th, 1989, and we were eating dinner. My mother had made dinner. My mother always cooked, and we were making dinner. And my father comes down the driveway, and I can see my grandmother in the passenger side. And my mom had, made a comment to her friend on the phone. She said, "Well, he's here with his mother, so he can't kill me tonight." My mother used to say famous last words. And yeah. That night, my grandmother came. My father left almost immediately. I showed her my Christmas toys. I talked to her a little bit. I gave her a hug and kiss goodnight. And I gave my mother a hug and a kiss goodnight and said, "I love you, Mommy." And I went to bed. About 3:15-ish in the morning, I woke up. I slept like a log as a kid. Something jolted me out of my sleep, and I realized something was happening. I think it was a scream, and I then heard two loud thuds that sounded like a body hitting a wall. And they were separated by about 60 seconds, and I was in my bed just holding onto my covers, thinking, do I get up? Because I could hear this coming from my mother's room, which was right down the hall from me. And I heard this murmur, my father just muttering. I knew it was him. I could hear his voice. And I'm thinking to myself, do I get up? Do I not get up? Weighing all these things in because I can't hear my mother. And I hear the second thud. And then I count the footsteps as they're coming down the hallway and the floorboards sinking and just the shuffle. And I always slept with my door open as a kid. And I'm sleeping and I'm looking this way, and I can see out of my peripheral vision the doorway. And I'm looking at the clock, and it says 3:18 a.m. I have this like Batman clock on my wall. And I'm sitting there, and I can see out of my peripheral vision, and I'm just saying to myself, don't look up. Because the feet had landed in the doorway. My father was standing in there looking in on me. And it was probably for a good 10 seconds that he was there. And I'm just thinking to myself, don't move. You're sound asleep. I thought even at that time, if something had happened, like there's nothing I can do about it till morning anyways. It's dark. It's, it's cold. It's all of this. The footsteps leave. And I somehow managed to go back to sleep. A couple hours later, I wake up, it's sunny, boom, sun's out. I run straight to my mother's room, and I'm looking in the front. My mother always made her bed. I still make my bed. First thing she always made me do, you get up, you make your bed, you start your day. The bed was a mess, and I'm rummaging through the sheets, and I'm looking for blood. Because she's not there, and I don't know what happened, but something happened in the middle of the night, and all I can think about is her telling me a month and a half earlier, if something happens to me, your father had me killed. And I come downstairs, and my father is sitting on the couch in the living room with a towel wrapped around his waist. He had just taken a shower. And I said to him, "Where is my mother?" And he didn't respond initially. So I said again, I said, "Where is my mother?" And he looks up, and it's so calm, it's so collected, and it's so cold and vacant. And he says to me, "Well, Mommy took a little vacation, Collier." And at that moment, I wasn't 100% sure that he had killed her, but I knew that he had done something to her. And I knew that it was on. And I was going to find out what happened. He launches into this whole diatribe about how we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call the FBI. And I remember him even saying that at the time. And, there's no CSI or anything like that at this time. But I remember just thinking it was just such an escalation. Here we are. We live in this small town in the middle of rural Ohio. And we're going to call the FBI. And he starts launching into this whole story of, because I'm asking him, well, what happened? I heard these sounds, and he starts gaslighting me and telling me, well, no, the sound was your mother threw her purse and it hit the wall. He tells me this whole story on how my mother came downstairs. They got into an argument. She threw her purse at him and her credit cards, walked out the back door in the dead of winter. This is December 31st in Ohio. No jacket, no purse, no money, no kids, and got into a car at the end of the driveway that was waiting for her. And I just looked at him and I'm like, you are a fucking liar. And I had known, and to dissect all of this beforehand, because when I met the girlfriend and when my mother was telling me they're going to get a divorce, I started learning that my father was a liar and had told all these, stories to me or certain things. And he just, and I would come to find out much more of this as I grew up later. But the level of deception and I just didn't trust my father as far as I could throw him, to use my mother's terminology at that time. And I can remember, so he's launching into this whole diatribe. We're not going to call the police. We're not going to call the FBI. He explains what happened. And then my grandmother comes in and she's asking my father what happened. And, Noreen left in the middle of the night. We got into the confrontation and this, that, and the other. And my grandmother seems to believe him. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way in hell that I am not calling everyone I know as soon as you leave. Because he was going that day because he was making this move to set up this wonderful new life with his new family. And he was moving his practice to Erie, Pennsylvania. So I lived in Mansfield. Erie, Pennsylvania is 6 hours away-ish, 5-6 hours away. My father leaves and my grandmother says to me, you're not going to call anybody. Listen to your father. And she leaves and my mother had just bought a cordless phone. I grab that cordless phone and I go upstairs, and in my bedroom, I had hidden a list of phone numbers for all of my mom's friends, because as the violence and everything was escalating in the house, once they had, she had said, I'm going to file for divorce, and he was ratcheting up. Even though he wasn't living with us, he was coming in. He would come in unannounced. He'd make a scene. He would yell at us. We were terrified of this man. I made a list of all my mother's friends, and I grabbed that list. I lock myself in the bathroom, and I just start running through all of them. And I say, look, this is what happened. I'm not supposed to call the police. You call the police. And 2 uniformed officers come out to the house, and they come in, and my grandmother is apoplectic. She's livid with me because she's yelling at me saying, you called the police, your father's going to be so pissed at you, etc. I'm excited because I'm like, okay, let's get this party started. And I'm walking around with him, and my grandmother's helicoptering over me, and we're upstairs in the hallway and where it leads into my mother's bedroom. And I pull one of the officers into another room, my sister's room, to show him what's going on. I said, I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him. And he's looking at me as this kid, and I can tell this guy doesn't believe a word I'm saying. And I'm like, something has happened to her. Something has happened to her. He's done something to her. And I could tell that he just didn't believe me. So I go. The officers leave, and my father comes home that night, and my grandmother's very angry, and my father isn't angry with me that the police came, but he does bring over his divorce lawyer, and they're having a whole little tete-a-tete in our dining room and strategically planning. And the next day he gets up and he leaves again. And another officer comes to the door, and his name is Lieutenant Detective David Messmore. And Dave is a very charming guy, and Dave earns my grandmother's trust and kind of comes in the house. And Dave is trying to calm my grandmother down. My grandmother said, "My son's a doctor. We're going to sue you." And she runs to go get the phone. And my mother as a kid always told me, Collier, she would tell me the stories of like growing up in Philadelphia, and she would go ride the carousels. You put the nickel in or whatever and ride the carousel, and to win the prize, you'd have to grab the brass ring. And she always told me as a kid, you want to seize that opportunity. You want to grab the brass ring in life. Like, look for those opportunities. And when my grandmother left and I'm alone with Dave, I realized that that's that moment for me. And I said to him, I said, "Look, I can't talk here. It's not safe. Give me your card, because tomorrow I'm going to go to school and I'll call you." Dave gave me his card, and he's looking at me because I'm like, he's done something to her, but I can't tell you what it is because she's going to come back and I'm going to get in trouble. And he gave me the card, and she comes back and he says, "You know what? I'm going to come back and I'll talk to the doctor later tonight," which he did. He came back, and that night, my father's girlfriend had come over. She prepared a roast. It was just the first time she's in our home, and I'm just appalled by all of it. But I'm just thinking, I'm going to watch this man like a hawk. And I started just taking notes and studying my father's behavior, because my father, again, a rageaholic, seemed very calm now, and almost in a wishy-washy sort of way. And Sherry's over, we're having this dinner. I don't want to eat any of it. And I go to bed that night. I get picked up by friends to go to school, because my mother normally would have taken me. And as soon as I go to school, I walk into the principal's office and I say, "Call this guy and get him down here." And Dave Messmore comes down to my school, and for 2-3 hours, I unravel the entirety of my parents' relationship, my father's proclivity for violence, everything that I can remember about my father. I can remember going down to Florida with him when we would go on these medical trips. We would go on these medical conferences in Clearwater Beach, Florida. And he rented a car, a convertible, and took a camera and took my mother and I down there and said he was doing surveillance for the Navy. And my father would tell these stories about flying fighter jets, which none of this was true, right? And I'm telling him all these little tidbits of information. And I say to Dave, I'm going to go home. And while my grandmother's downstairs dealing with my sister, making dinner, I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to pull out the bookshelf to the crawl space, and I'm going to look for my mother's body. I'm going to look and see if I can find this purse that she would never leave the house without, that has all of her stuff. I'm going to try to find this. I'm going to look for this one sweater that she would have taken with her. I'm going to try to find... I just started rattling off all these clues to him that I'm going to look for. And I think he's looking at me like I'm crazy, because he's like, who is this kid? And I'm a very intelligent, little 11-year-old, but I'm laying out like, this is how we're going to investigate this case together. And that's what I did. And over the course of the next 3 weeks, Dave and I worked together, and I started gathering evidence against my father. My father had come home one night and he had all these marks on his hand, these scratches. And my father had really well manicured hands. He was a doctor, but he always took really good care of his hands. He had all these cuts. And I asked him about it. He was like, I hurt them I was moving boxes. And then he was sore one night. So he said he was moving filing cabinets and had to, and he was really sore and asked me to rub Bengay on his shoulders, which is like an ointment, like a icy hot. And I started just noticing all of these things. And he would have this, he had gone from this behavior of being this very violent, aggressive guy to being this very passive almost person. It was a total shift in who he was. And I can remember I had just gotten a Nintendo for Christmas that year. I was the last kid on my block to get one. I was playing a game called Double Dragon. And he saw me playing it and he goes, "What is this game? This is a violent game. I never would have gotten this game for you if I had known it was violent." And I said, "Okay, that's weird. My father, who chastises me and insults me and berates me for not watching violent movies with him, is now all of a sudden upset that I'm playing a fighting game on a Nintendo." And I'm telling all of this back to Dave, and I'm saying everything is so weird. And I'm asking him every day while I go to school. I'm calling because I'm not focused on schoolwork. I'm not focused on anything but finding my mother. And it wasn't until halfway through January of that year that I found something really significant. My father asked me, he goes, "Hey, I'm going to go to my office to get paperwork again." And he's like, "Do you want to come with me?" And I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to let you out of my sight. I go to his office with him, and when we're coming back to the house, we stop at a gas station. And again, my father goes into the gas station to pay for gas, and I'm just going to start rummaging through his truck. And I open up the center console of the truck, and I find 2 photographs. One is of his girlfriend with her 2 children sitting in front of a fireplace that's covered in plastic. And the other one is of a house that I've never seen before. And I'm like, this is connected. So just file that away. And the next day I go to school. I call Dave Messmore. I say, "I found these photographs in his truck. She's with him. She's in this. This is no coincidence. This has to be the house that she's in." And then I don't hear from Dave for a while. And a few days go by and I check in with him again. But I'm noticing my father's behavior at home. He's starting to get his lawyer is over every night and they're having these meetings in the kitchen or in the dining room. And he says to me, he's just very, very nervous. Like I think that he can feel the walls closing in around him, but he doesn't know what's happening. And every night when we're having dinner, he would say things like, "I wonder where mommy is at. I wonder what mommy is doing. I wonder, where she could be eating, what she's having for dinner tonight. It's just such a shame that she left us in this state." And he says to me, he goes, "Collier," he's like, "I think we should go on a father and son trip. I have a medical conference going on in Florida in a week. I want you to come down with me and we'll make it a father and son trip because I can see you're really affected by your mother leaving. And this will be a great bonding trip for us." And at that moment, I knew I wasn't coming back from Florida. I call Dave Messmore. The next day I go to school and I say, "He's going to take me to Florida. I'm not coming back." 2 days later, I wake up, child services in my bedroom. They're like, I can hear all this commotion in the house. They're like, "Pack a bag. We got 20 minutes to get out of here." I pack a bag for my sister. I come downstairs. My dog is there. I say, "Can we take my dog?" And they say, "No, we'll come back for your dog." I never saw my dog again. I loved my dog very much. And as I'm downstairs, the entire house is filled with detectives, men and women in white lab coats. Dave Messmore is there serving a search warrant. They are searching my house for my mother. And I was like, "No, life is never going to be the same." I don't go to school. I don't go back to school that day. I go to the principal of my school's house and I kind of wait. And I remember a social worker came and introduced herself as a social worker. And I didn't know what a social worker was. I know it wasn't good if you had a social worker. And she's essentially explaining to me, police are looking for your father. And something's going on. And life would never be the same. Life would never be the same again. That night I had the worst asthma attack of my life. And I thought I was going to die. I didn't have any of my medicine. I didn't take that from the house. I didn't have my breathing machine. And I was really scared. And I got taken to the hospital the next morning to get a breathing treatment. And a friend of the family was there, and he's a cardiologist, and he gives me an injection for steroids to take the swelling down, and I do the breathing treatment, and then they tell me. They say, Collier, Lieutenant Messmore found your mom. And it's like this eternal pause. And then they say, and she was dead. It is really hard. It is really difficult to articulate the kind of cognitive dissonance that you experience, because on one hand, what you knew in your heart was true. What had happened really happened. And then the other hand, what you knew what happened is really what happened. And life would never be the same. You would never see the one person who meant the entire world to you ever again. Sorry, man. Thanks. I wish that I could say that that was like where it really ended. But I think that was like really where it all began.
You were how old?
I was 11 years old. When I look back on my life, I think that's where, like, you know, I have these really fond and amazing memories that I drolled on and on about for 40 some minutes. I also think at that moment it was in, you know, like something in you fractures and you become something that you never knew that you could become, for good or for bad, right? I like to think it was for good. But I was angry. And I remember Dave Messmore came to see me later on that night, and he told me, he's like, it was the house you found the photo of, that I found her. He asked me about a blue tarp. Had I ever seen a blue tarp? And I said, my father took me to Kmart to buy a blue tarp. It's what my father used to wrap my mother's body in, the tarp that I bought with him. He asked me about indoor-outdoor carpeting. It was on our porch for 6 months before. He used that to cover her shallow concrete grave in the basement of that house that I found the photos of. I testified at the grand jury a couple of days later, securing my father's indictment for the murder of my mother. And I think that, you know, I remember my mother's sister came to my Aunt Carol, came to see me. There was a memorial service. I wasn't allowed to go to the actual funeral because I was the witness. And I thought that because of what I had done and what I had try to get justice for my mother and try to, okay, like I got him caught, right? And now I'm going to see this through. That would mean something to my family. But it didn't. And I don't know if it's because trauma is such a weird thing. There's so much nuance to it. So many people can handle so much and so many people can handle so little. And I can remember my aunt, my godmother, saying to me, "We cannot take you in because you look like your father." And I remember my godfather, my mother's best friend, my father's brother, saying to me, "We will not take you in. You're not a part of our family unless you say that you were lying about everything." So I went into the foster care system. And for anyone that knows about the foster care system, it doesn't matter. It is fucking awful. And that presented a whole other set of challenges. And I was pretty well isolated from a lot of people. I couldn't watch, obviously there's no internet and no phones at that time, cell phones, but there is, I couldn't watch television. I couldn't read the newspaper. I was limited to talking to certain people. I couldn't discuss things in the case. And I was in a not great, somewhat abusive foster care situation, and it wasn't really fun. They weren't very nice to me. They wanted custody of my sister, so that's what they were focused on. And I had to find it in myself to testify against my father. And I remember the prosecutor saying to me, like, "You don't have to do this." I remember Dave Messmer saying, "You don't have to do this." And I was like, over my dead body, I'm not doing this. Like, I'm seeing this through. And I knew so I was 12, I was 11 when the murder occurred and 12 when it went to trial. And I can just remember looking in the mirror at myself. And I tell young people about this. I tell people about this stuff all the time. I knew that if I didn't do what I had to do, if I didn't tell the truth, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. And I just know that, I knew that I wouldn't be able to function as an adult. I wouldn't be able to live my life. But I testified against my father for 2 days at his trial. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I stared him down in the courtroom. He wouldn't look back at me. And he is still incarcerated to this day. There's like this obsession with true crime and in general and human behavior, right? And I became someone who, even at that age, when this wasn't like there was podcasts out or any of this stuff, I was somebody who became very acutely aware of the fact that, we were very quick to dismiss, bad guy goes to jail, state gets this restitution, the victim is dead, the gavel hits, judge's gavel hits, we say next. And we'll think about the consequences and the impacts. But this case was the largest murder trial in Ohio history at that time. I mean, it was Dr. Sam Shepard and my father. It was the first time a kid had testified. I mean, I was on television testifying. Like, I was on the TV. So as I think about it back now, I mean, it's like a non-fun way of being like a child actor. And I couldn't go anywhere growing up where people didn't know who I was, because I ended up staying in the small town. And the one thing that I wanted is, after the trial was done, I developed such a bond with Dave Messmer, who was the detective, who I had bonded with in the penultimate moment of my life. if you will. And I said, would you adopt me? And he said, yes. And I thought, okay, there might be a happy ending to this story in a way. Like, okay, I'll get with this family and I'll have this bond with this family, and I loved them so much. And get to the court because I was, as I said, I was living in foster care, but then they were going to award me custody to a family eventually. And the judge had a grudge against Dave and the police department and said, you didn't think I was actually going to award custody to the guy that put your father away, did you? I was hysterical. I left the courtroom. I couldn't believe it because it was the one thing I wanted. Like the one thing. Like, could I not have that moment? Like the happy ending to this tragedy. And I'm not sitting here saying that this was, at the time, it was such a monumental thing to me to not get that. It's like, can I just get a win somehow? And but I was awarded custody to another family, which is a great family that I have a deep bond with. But I grew up in this small town, and everyone knew who I was, and I couldn't go anywhere. And I don't think my parents or my adopted parents really even realized that in taking me on, what they were really getting into. Because we couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't go out to eat. I remember being cornered in a Walmart many times, but being cornered with a Walmart open, and it was in the detergent aisle, and it's smelling, and the smells of the detergent, this toxic, and the woman's zipping up and down my zipper, my jacket, asking me to like tell her about these stories. And I was the type of kid who I was very outspoken, very outgoing. I mean, I testified at this trial, and I would talk to anybody that wanted to talk to me because I'd be like, well, if you really want the real story, I'll give it to you because I wanted to get it off my chest. So these people would always get a lot more information than they bargained for, as the viewer notices probably now. But I would tell everybody and anybody, you want to know the story? Here's the story. This is what I thought here. And people were fascinated. But I think that at that time, I started realizing, and I was always a creative kid, and that there's a way to use all of this in a way that could benefit me and could benefit others from hearing stories, or at least get this off my chest, right? But I was very late, as a child, very focused on doing something with all this story. But I had many moments because I was adopted into this family. It was a very large, the family I was adopted into I had a younger brother. My parents have a younger sibling who's 3 years younger than me, but the family was very large. Both my parents have lots of brothers and sisters. And so, family reunions, if that was something, I was an only child for the majority of my life. So going into a situation like this where I had all this cousins and family, it was really wild. But it wasn't without its real challenges. And I think a lot of that took a toll on my adopted parents in my early teenage years. And things were somewhat tenuous at home. And I remember I was in my sophomore chemistry class, and I got notified to come to the principal's office. And I went to the principal's office, and both my parents were there, and I'm thinking, like, what did I do wrong now? Because I was a pretty good kid. And they said, your parents are going to take you to a hospital. And I was taken to a place called Harding Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And Harding Hospital is a mental institution. And I couldn't understand why, because I understand that there were issues at home. There was a lot going on with the dynamics of having a child like myself who's been through so much trauma. But I also feel like I was a really good kid, but also, there was just so much going on that I didn't even understand, and processing with my father, and my adopted father, being protective, would read my father's letters and explain to me, like, your father's manipulating you here. This is what gaslighting is. This is this. But I think there was a inherent fear and with my parents that I would end up being like him in a lot of ways, right? So they wanted to sort of, get that out of me, or whatever that was. And I went to this mental institution. I can remember getting checked in. I was supposed to be there for 3 weeks. And I'm like, this is insane, to myself. And I'm riding because they have an intake facility, and then they take you to the hospital. For anyone that's been in a mental institution, they understand this. And I'm riding, there's a kid in the car with me, and he looks at me and he goes, "What are you in here for?" I stabbed a kid. I'm doing this to avoid juvie, which is like juvenile detention, juvenile hall, like kid prison. And he stabbed a kid. And he's like, "What did you do?" And I said, I think my parents think I lie too much. And this is something that I've never even shared about any of this. But I remember I was in that institution, and it is a whole different world. And it's very hard to be institutionalized when you have a father who is also institutionalized, and all of the mind fuck that goes on when you're in here and you can't understand why you're in here. And am I going to be like him? Is that why I'm here? There's a kid that stabbed somebody here. They wake me up every 2 hours for suicide watch. So I can't even sleep because they do suicide watch. I'm not going to kill myself. They kept my razor. I just started shaving. I have to ask for permission to do that. I just saw a kid running around going crazy saying burrito me, and they wrap him up in a sponge blanket and tackle him. And I'm like, what is happening? And I've got kids telling me that they're going to kill me, kick my ass, because there's big kids, there's angry kids in these institutions. And thank God that my adopted father loved to play ping pong. He played ping pong in the Army. We had a ping pong table downstairs because they had a ping pong table at this facility. And I was like, you know what? The one thing I can do to save my ass is play ping pong. And I would play ping pong and beat all these people, and beat the counselors, and beat everybody. I was the ping pong wizard in this mental institution. And the doctor who headed the hospital, his name was Dr. William Christopher. He was one of the top child psychologists in the country at that time. And he calls me into his office. I'm doing therapy, intense therapy situations, doing all these things, whatever, Rorschach, does this square look like this? All the psychological tests. And he calls me in on the 5th day, and he says, "Collier, I don't know how you are who you are, but you are a completely normal teenager going through normal teenage shit, and I'm not letting you stay here another minute. You're dismissed." And I'll tell you something, that was a really long car ride back with my parents. But I found something there. And I was thinking about it today because I've never talked about this before. I connected with a sense of humanity from that experience. I saw really troubled people. I saw violent people. I saw people who had been through similar situations that I had been through, but also not as extreme, right? That had come from maybe poverty or abusive backgrounds, alcoholic parents, latchkey kids, right? And talking to them too while I'm playing ping pong, while I'm getting to know people. And those experiences, I think, that 5 days in that hospital transformed my life in ways that I never even realized until recently, because I got to know the humanity of people. And I think that was such an important lesson, because I think one of the biggest fears of my parents was they didn't want me to be a victim or have a victim mentality or have a an entitlement. The world owes me something. I think I really learned that in that experience. But I also learned that I could make a life and I could do something. And everything changed after that. I became junior and senior class president of my high school. I got all A's, at least once. I was in all the academic stuff. I tennis team captain. I became the high school choir star. I found my voice as a kid. I had 2 jobs in high school. Everybody loved me. It was like this thing that I found, and it was this way because I grew up wondering if people really wanted to like me for Collier or like me for the fact that I was this kid who was from this big murder trial. And I took all of that and I went to college, and then I dropped out of school and I said, I want to move to a place where I don't know anybody. I want to move to California because it looks beautiful. I heard the Beach Boys songs growing up, and I'm going to go and tell this story. And I worked. I became a cinematographer. I became a filmmaker, and I continued over the years to have a relationship with my father because I knew, like when I was in college, I was at Ohio University School of Music, and it was not far from Lucasville. My father was transferred there, and Lucasville was, for those that are watching, Lucasville had a massive riot during the Clinton years. The inmates took over the prison for like 9 or 11 days or something. It was horrible. It was a bad place, bad, maxi security prison. It was scary to go visit. But I remember I had this dream when I was in college. My mother came to me and said, you need to forgive your father. You need to do it for you. And so I tried my best to cultivate this relationship while at the same time realizing and trying to come to terms with the fact that, can I be this man? And this has haunted me my whole life because where I might feel very healed and fulfilled, I still wonder that. I still echo relationships that are very similar to that of my father, narcissistic, abusive relationships with women. I for years in my 20s experimented sexually, men, women, older women, older men, younger men. I was a very free spirit, but I was always trying to find myself. And I think that the big point for me was when my father was up for parole the first time. And I knew this opportunity would exist because I knew my father wasn't going to get out on parole in the first time. But I knew that if I had vouched for his parole, even though I couldn't take care of him, I couldn't have my father in my life, and I live in California, they're not going to release him. There was 20 other people I talked to that were like, we're saying no, including the prosecutor, Dave Messmore, the investigator, everybody. No, don't let this man out of prison. But it gave me a way to get my father involved in my sort of scheme, if you will, or what I wanted to do with my life, which is to tell this story. And I knew that I couldn't do it without him. Because ultimately, all I ever wanted to do was to sit down and not only hold my father's feet to the fire, but also offer him an opportunity to tell me what happened and to see if once and for all, I really could be that person that my father is. Am I capable of that type of psychosis, psychopathy? Could I murder someone, murder my partner? Because when you grow up and you have everyone looking at you that you've been through this, and for years in Los Angeles, I didn't tell a soul about my story. I did call his dad killed his mom. He was adopted. He's from Ohio. Like, that's all anybody knew. Never ever knew the details. A couple girlfriends that I dated knew, some of my very, very close friends, but nobody knew my story in general. And very surface details, if they even knew that. And because I wanted to get that sense of what are people looking at me for? Who am I? Who is Collier to you? Who's Collier to Mark? Who's Collier to the world? What is that feedback without knowing my backstory? And at the same time, when some would find out, I'd be dating a girl, their parents would find out, well, are you sure about this guy? Well, I mean, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or this happened. You sure? Is he not? I get it. But that's what I had to live with. And I think one of the hardest things that people don't realize is when you go through something like this and people start to unravel your story and they come into your life, or a girl says, hey, I'm dating this guy. And he's really cute. He's really nice. He's really smart. His dad's kind of he's comes from a fucked up story. And then they start to hear it. And then, I can't blame people for thinking like, hey, is he safe? Is he safe to be around? Do you feel safe? I don't know what I would think. I talked about the humanity of being in the mental institution and seeing other people that were in pain and realizing that people go through real shit in life. But I think anyone that deals with any sort of prejudice is in a situation where they're like, okay, well, they think that I'm going to be this person and I'm not this person. And I, for such a long time, was very focused on finding out if I could be that person that my father is. And I spent years trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the story, whether it's going to be a documentary, whether it's going to be a scripted series, whether I'm going to share this. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with it. But I was able to go into the prison and have a relationship with my father. I remember I was working as a cinematographer, and they would do all the production for the state of Ohio in his prison. And I would go into the prison and teach the prisoners how to use tools like Final Cut Pro and Adobe Photoshop in their studio facilities. I helped them get their camera packages, Blackmagic cameras, as a matter of fact, from B&H for their studio in the prison. And I was able to go in and behind the bars or behind go in to actually be in the actual prison and interact with my father and see his life. And I just remember looking at seeing this world and knowing that he put himself there. This wasn't like wrong place, wrong time, drunk, hit somebody, didn't realize what happened. This was a premeditated murder of my mother. And to see this world that exists, that someone voluntarily put themselves into, from having something that was so amazing, money, adoration of the public, women, he was a womanizer, and then to give all this up because why? And I almost started to develop this empathy for my father, sympathy for my father rather, because I couldn't empathize with him, but I could empathize with almost the notion of being in prison, because when you have someone who's incarcerated that you're connected to, it's almost like you're in there with them in a lot of ways. I think many people would say that who have loved ones that are incarcerated. It's like you're doing time too, it's just in a different way. And whether that is you're doing time because you're waiting for them to get out to see them again, you're waiting for them to get out because your life is threatened by them, or you're waiting for them to die and you'll never get to see them again. And when I think about that, I started to really sympathize. How could someone have life so good and squander it so badly? And I remember my grandmother before she died. This was 1997, 98. I didn't even know she died. Nobody even called me. I have no connection to my family, my birth family whatsoever. It's very sad. But I remember I called up to talk to her because I had just seen her a few weeks before. And my little cousin at the time picked up the phone and said, Nana died. That's how I found out that my grandmother died. And I remember the last time I was with her, she was a little Italian lady. She was 84 years old at the time, and we were making pizzelles in the kitchen of her apartment. And she just kind of drifted off into space, and she said, my Jackie, my father's name was John, but he went by Jack. My Jackie, what a waste of talent. And that's what I think my father is. It's a waste of talent. To throw everything away for what? All he had to do was divorce my mother. Move on. You had a girlfriend who was 20 years younger than you. A new baby on the way. A new family. Money. The whole... It's sad. I feel sorry for him in a lot of ways. And I think that for the entirety of my life, I worked very hard to try to figure out, am I that person? And it wasn't until I sat down with a camera crew across from my father and finally asked him the question of, why did you murder my mother? That I finally realized that this person that I was afraid of becoming, I wasn't him. And that I was my mother's son. I got some great qualities from him, but I got the best ones from her.
Beautiful story.
Thanks, man.
Thank you. That was amazing, Collier. Even though Soft White Underbelly consists of a lot of videos, it's really still a photography project to me. And if you appreciate the photography, sometimes it's difficult to enjoy it when it's scrolling down the screen, which is the only option I had in this horizontal format on YouTube. So last year we came out with the first Soft White Underbelly book, which is a collection of the best portraits from the thousands of interviews I've done. Each portrait in this book is accompanied by an interesting quote from the person's interview.
Oh my God.
There's more.
Wow. These aren't as bad as I thought. I look like a witch.
I will not be reprinting this book when it sells out. So once it's gone for good. You can order yours at softwhiteunderbelly.org. $125, $150 for a signed copy. And thank you for watching.